Please welcome to the stage Dr. Kafui Dzirasa.
Well, good morning. How are you all doing? It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I've been working on limiting my travel schedule as much as possible. When I got the email from Dr. Seal, I said it'd be fantastic to have the opportunity to speak at home with family for once. It's quite unusual when I travel that I see audiences looking back at me that look like myself. So, good morning, family. I'm going to set my timer because I've been told that it's important not to act like a typical scientist and talk twice as long as I'm supposed to. And I send you greetings from Christ Our King Community Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. My pastor, unfortunately, had a family emergency and couldn't be here this morning. So I am a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and an engineer. And I thought I would do something a little bit different this morning. Rather than start by giving you medical information and giving you slides, I thought I would tell you a story. And I wanted to frame this story around one of the first major sermons that Jesus Christ gave. And I'm doing this because I think there's a very important lesson of mental health tucked behind that story. So to begin that story, I'll begin with a little bit of history. And we'll start the history at Solomon. Solomon, the great king. He was the son of David. God asked him what he wanted, and he said, I wanted wisdom. And in addition to giving him wisdom, he gave him riches, he gave him wealth, he gave him power. And Solomon would ultimately build the great temple. And so if you're thinking about this scenario, it's essentially the height of civilization in the world in the history of the Jewish community. They're now the most powerful nation on earth. Folks are coming from Egypt to see all the great wonders in Israel. And as the text would outline, there was this prophecy, and his dad would teach him this prophecy that a kingdom was coming that was even greater than the kingdom that was set up. So imagine the richest, the powerfulest, the most amazing nation on earth in the history of the world, and there's a prophecy that something even greater is coming, something that was promised to Abraham so many generations beforehand. And so the people are all excited about what this kingdom can look like because they're already seeing how amazing the kingdom of Solomon is. And Solomon would pass away. The kingdom would be handed to his son Rehoboam, who would lose the kingdom. And the kingdom would be split into the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, and then they would go on to have civil wars back and forth for hundreds of years. And about 350 years later, the kingdom would fall to Babylon, and the king Nebuchadnezzar, who would be described as a wicked king. This is where we enter the prophets like Daniel. You know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. You know the story of the Hebrew boys, Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their slave names. And as you would see, this great kingdom would be delivered into slavery. These people who had this rich history, this amazing temple, would be delivered into the hands of a wicked kingdom. Babylon would be conquered by Persia and Cyrus the Great. Then would come along Alexander the Great, with the Greeks conquering them, and ultimately Caesar would come along, and Rome would rise as the new kingdom in the world. When the Roman kingdom arose, at first they were partners with the Jewish kingdom. It was established as a favorable religion, and ultimately the emperor would rise, Augustus, and he would basically take over society. Right? And so now you have this new society. This is the framework that Jesus shows up. He shows up, there's this new society. Rome is conquering. And you can imagine what it was like for these Jewish individuals who had this history of thinking about themselves as the greatest society in the world. And now they're in this empire of Rome. It would almost be like you're sitting in a state or community that's been a little bit gerrymandered, or perhaps there's been a little bit of voter suppression. Perhaps you don't have health care or good education. It was these group of individuals who had basically been disenfranchised in their society, sitting there in this kingdom. And all the while, they had this prophecy that this new king would come and establish a kingdom, reestablish a kingdom for them. So this is the situation of the time when Jesus Christ arrives. This prophecy was so powerful that there was a king that was over the Jews, Herod the Great. It was so powerful. He was so scared of this prophecy, this idea of losing political power to this coming king, that when the wise men came and told him that a king had been born, he killed all the kids, right? He killed everybody under 2. That's how scared he was of this prophecy. So this thing was real. It was an entrenched part of society. So now we've got these folks in this arena. This guy shows up. He's like the greatest preacher of all time, John the Baptist. He shows up and he's like, the guy's coming, right? He's about to show up, right? He's like the hype man, right? He's like blessing people. He's baptizing people. And he's like, look, the guy is coming. The king is coming. And he's like so awesome, I can't even like lace up his Nikes, right? The guy's about to throw down, right? So he's got everybody hyped up, right? The guy finally shows up, right? And then he starts moving around and he's healing people, he's driving out the sick, and he shows up at a mountain to give his first sermon, right? So he's up on the mountain, the crowd comes around, they all sit down, and the first sermon starts. Now, mind you, these people are disenfranchised. They've been waiting on this guy to show up forever to reestablish their place in the world and give them their throne back. And you know how he starts? He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, wait a minute. Now, it's like time for the revolution, right? Like, we have all gathered. Here's the kingdom. We're disenfranchised. Like, we want our voting rights back, right? Like, we're trying to take the White House. And this guy shows up talking about some blessed in the poor are the poor in spirit, for theirs the kingdom of God. Now, you got to be kidding, right? Like, the kingdom is right here. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about the Roman Empire is what we seek to take over. So he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who've been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against me. Rejoice and be glad." Now, you have got to be kidding. Now, I want you all to imagine yourself in this time. You have been persecuted. You have been abused. Political power has been gone. There is a promise that you carry deep in your heart that is the only thing that keeps you going from day to day. And somebody says, "You're blessed because they're cursing you." But he doesn't stop there. He goes on, right? Now imagine this history that I'm talking about, this temple. There's like gold flowing everywhere. People got like the gold Nikes on, the gold jackets on, the gold Rolexes on. This is their history. And then he says, "Don't store yourself treasure on earth where moth and rust decay. Store your treasure in heaven where thieves don't break in and steal and moth and rust don't decay. For wherever your treasure is, there also your heart will be." Now I am sure the poor folks is sitting in the audience. Like, when are they going to start handing out the gifts, right? When's the money going to start flowing down from heaven, right? And when am I going to become the governor or the king? Like, what's the plan here? There's probably some young folks there that are a little militant, right? So they want to know what the action strategy is. And he's talking about where they should, like, put their treasure in heaven and that they should be blessed to be poor and to be cursed. And he finishes with this. Mind you, these are the poorest people in society. He says, "For this reason I say to you, don't be worried about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or your body, as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds in the air. They do not sow, they do not reap, they do not gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are they not worth more than you? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why you are worrying about clothing? Observe the lilies in the field grow. They don't toil, they don't spin. Yet I say to you, not even Solomon, in all of his glory, clothed themselves like one of these. But if God clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown in the furnace, will he not much more clothe you? So don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough worries of its own. So you really got to ask yourself, what is Jesus talking about? Like, why would this be his first sermon? I mean, John the Baptist has hyped him up. Herod has killed all the guys that are around that are his age, right? So there are not that many brothers around. There are probably a lot of sisters in the audience. And this is his first message that he's giving to these individuals who are probably hungry, who probably don't have the nice clothes on. And he's telling them, don't worry about eating, don't worry about what you're going to drink, and don't worry about your clothes. Something has got to be really disjointed about this message that they're hearing in their experience. Because sometimes we read this with a 21st century lens, and we're like, that's amazing. Yes, I shouldn't worry. But that's because we got so much compared to every other nation in the world and every other time in history. But that is not the situation in which this message was delivered. So what is Jesus talking about? Right? The audience was probably sitting there just as confused as you are, wondering why a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist has shown up talking about Jewish history and Jesus' first sermon. But the reason I'm here, and the reason I've started with this message, is because I think that science, and not simply religion, but also science, has an important role to play in understanding this message that God is delivering. Now, when I talk about science, sometimes there's a little bit of tension, right? You might have adjusted your seat a little bit when I said science and not simply religion. This tension between science and religion is not new. You can understand this tension between science and religion even in the trial of Galileo, who was tried with heresy and excommunicated from the church because he had the nerve to say the sun was going around the earth and not that the earth was going around the sun, right? This tension can even be seen in our own history, and I want to be gentle with this. It's a history in which religion was used in some sense to make the African slave more docile. And this happened and was delivered and it was taught while education was simultaneously not only restricted, but it was criminalized. So we experience this tension both in the history of science and religion more globally, but even in our own history as well. But my point here, and the message that I hope to deliver to you, is that this tension is artificial. For the sake of these presentation, I'll simply say that science is the observation of things as they are. It's the observation and the description of things as they are. So if you believe that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and if you believe that God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God said that light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and there was evening, and there was morning, and there was the first day, and if you believe that God said, let us create man in our own image, and he took the dust of the earth and formed it into man and breathed breath into his nostrils, and said it is not good for man to be alone, and took a rib and formed woman and put him in the garden, if you believe that, then you believe that you can learn about the Creator from studying and observing the creation. This is not a far-fetched idea. This is not a far-fetched idea. And I want to frame this message by beginning and saying that we should be thinking about it then as there not being a distinction between science and religion. Science is just the set of rules that God put in place for creating what we observe. Paul put it this way. He put it in this way in his letter to the church in Rome. He said, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. So lessons that you can learn through science can help you understand the nature of the Creator himself and herself. And I say that because when God created man in his image, woman was inside as well. So what is Jesus trying to say in his first sermon? And I'll frame this from the perspective of a scientist and a psychiatrist. I believe that what Jesus was trying to teach folks in the pews that day on the mountain was that their thoughts shapes everything about them, including their ability to experience faith. See, their attributes, their perspectives, their values, and what they worry about. And so you've heard you've heard that it's been said, stop living in the past. I've sat in a couple sermons where people say, stop living in the past. Well, as a psychiatrist and the neuroscientist, what I'm here to tell you today, that it's impossible not to live in the past. Unless you have a gift of prophecy, and perhaps then you're living in the present or the future, you are absolutely stuck living in the past. When I came up, there was an example of what happens when somebody says something and gives you a command, and how it processes in your brain. And the very reality is that everything you're hearing that I'm saying is something that I actually said in the past, because it takes time for you to hear it. Everything you see is something that happened in the past, because it takes time for you to see it. For all the sports fans out there, if you sat a little bit far away at a baseball field and the person swings the bat and hits the ball, you see the ball fly off, and then you hear the sound. It's not that the sound happened at a different time that the bat hit the ball. It's that it takes you longer to hear the sound because it takes a while to get to you. So our very experiences, our very perceptions are in the past. And you have this organ that's inside of your head called the brain. And the way that organ keeps you alive, the way it's able to help you survive, is it predicts the future. So it says, the last time a little kid threw a ball at me, it hit me in the head. So when I see the ball coming, I should move, because it's going to be here before I get out the way. And so it uses experiences, because your brain is living in the past, to predict the future, which is actually now. And so if Jesus is going to deliver this message to tell people how to live and to tell people how to walk out in this faith, in this new situation, he's got to help them understand that their very thoughts are what allows them to move from living in the past to living in now. So one of the more important things here, and before I dig into some of the meat, so I can show you my utility as a scientist and a neuroscientist, and explain to my mom why I spent 30 years in school, is that this idea that your expectations shape your experience. Because it's your expectations that connect what's happening, which is really the past by the time it gets to you, to your ability to live in now. As the 23rd chapter of Proverbs would say, as a man thinketh, so he is. Right? So you've heard it's been said, you are what you eat, and you're going to probably hear that throughout this conference. I'm here to tell you that you are what you think. And so this idea of our thoughts and our perspectives and how they shape our world is so centrally important. And what you think is locked within this organ that's inside of your head called the brain. Now, this organ is tiny enough to fit in the palms of both of your hands. It's got over 200 billion cells called neurons and other cell types, and about half of them can process electricity from the outside world. So your brain takes in all of these external signals, changes it, chemical energy and electrical energy, and then it does this series of computations based on information in the past to predict the future. And the whole goal of that is to allow your survival. Now I'm going to connect this because I want to show you how critical this is in the framing of Scripture. And so I'm going to connect the dots for you again before we get into the details of mental health. And I'll show you how seriously the author of many of the letters in the New Testament took this very theme. Now, this author, Saul, who became Paul, was a great persecutor of the early Christians. He would meet God on a road and then would go off to live a life where he was helping shape the early church as it was expanding. He was an interesting guy, right? He was Roman and he was Hebrew, and he was all of these things in one. And here's what he would say in his letter to the church in Ephesus. I don't have a whole lot of time to get into it, but there's a whole lot going on in Ephesus. Think of it as like Las Vegas back then. And here's what he said. And it's an interesting the thing that he wrote to them that I think it's very easy to miss how this connects with the same message that Jesus was giving. And he says, "Do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit." So do not wine, filled with the Spirit. And again here, I think science can provide a really good explanation of how what he's saying connects to what Jesus was saying in his first message. So the reason wine makes you drunk is because as it's being produced from fermented grapes. And one of the things these fermented grapes do, as it's producing these fermented grapes, is it produces a compound or a chemical called ethanol. 2 carbons, 5 hydrogens, and then a hydroxyl, OH, C2, H5, OH. And so when you drink wine, it enters into your intestinal tract, it can cross into your bloodstream, and then your brain has a protective layer on it called the blood-brain barrier. Ethanol can actually cross it. So this molecule, chemical, that's in wine, enters your bloodstream, and it can cross into your brain. When it goes into your brain, it can bind or connect to antennas on some of these brain cells I talked about and make them activate less. So this is why when you get drunk, you might fall, like none of y'all know about that, you might, the folks that aren't here, right? You might talk a little bit slower, you might trip over yourself, because there are parts of your brain that are literally being turned off. Even parts of your brain that are responsible for judgment and decision making can turn down. And so if you understand that wine, and the reason it makes you drunk is because of a chemical that has a physical interaction with your brain, what that suggests, what Paul is saying, is that your brain, this organ, it connects your physical body with your ability to experience God. And so this organ, right, this organ that's allowing you to take the past and predict the future, what Paul is saying here is this organ is so important that it's a thing that connects your physical body with being filled with the Spirit. This thing that had been promised, right? That Jesus was like, I'm going, but I'm going to send this thing. And when you have this thing, you're going to have power, right? Paul is saying the conduit to that is an organ inside of your head. And so if we're going to talk about the state of mental health, we all have to frame ourselves, particularly in the Black church, we all have to start with an understanding that the reason why mental health is so important is because the brain is the organ that gets sick when you have mental health issues. And what that means is that this, unlike cancer, right, unlike diabetes, this set of illnesses targets the organ that connects our physical body with the ability to be filled with the Spirit. So there are 2 points when it comes to the state of Black mental health. And I'll start with the good news. The good news is if you look at the data, the incidence, in other words, the prevalence, the amounts of mental health issues that are around are not different for Black folk and the general population. That's the good news. The bad news is that the utilization of mental health resources is substantially worse. In other words, folks get sick the same, folks don't get treated the same. And I believe that there are many, almost like 2 to 1 compared Black folk to our Caucasian brothers and sisters. And a lot of folks, whether they're in the medical community or the scientific community, has set out, perhaps, to blame you all. And I think that that is the most inaccurate conclusion that one could reach. As I was talking to my colleagues about preparing this talk, some of them were like, why do you do that? You know, folks just say, when you have mental health issues, you just got to pray about it, right? And that's the beginning and the ending of things, right? But I disagree with their conclusion, and I think science supports the important work that you do. So I'm going to tell you about two scientific perspectives, right? And then I'm going to hopefully tell you about the role that we can play together to helping treat and focus on mental health such that people can experience the full measure of faith. The first set of studies, is based on this idea of the placebo effect. Have any of you heard of the placebo effect? So whenever you test a medication, right, you take a large group of people, you split them in half, and then one of them gets the medication, and then one of them gets something that looks like the medication, but it doesn't have the ingredient in there. It's a sugar pill, right? And they measure how much better does the person with the medication do compared to the person on the sugar pill, right? And then they say, if the medication is good, the person on the real medication should do better than the person on the sugar pill. But if you ever dig in and you look at the data, what you realize is that the person who's getting the sugar pill actually is way better than the person who doesn't get the sugar pill. And the majority of the healing effects that happen are based on the sugar pill. So if someone bad is here, the sugar pill takes you here, and the rest of the medication takes you here. And the reason why I think that is so important for this community is because it means that there's something very important about believing that you're being treated and believing that you can get better. And so I think the important take home here is that hope is actually medicine, and the scientific literature supports that. And so that means when you all are delivering hope to people, it is medicine. And you have an important role to play in delivering hope to people and providing them that support. The scientific literature supports that. Now, it doesn't mean, don't take me wrong, it doesn't mean that the medicine doesn't get you better too. It doesn't mean it doesn't have value, right? But it is the effect that you see in the placebo or the hope plus the medication that gets you better. And this mistake that scientists and sometimes folks in the medical community make is they put all the faith in the medicine when there's an incredible value to the hope. And the hope has to be culturally appropriate. And the church does much better job of connecting to the cultural appropriateness of the hope than the medicine does some of the times. So I think there's a very important role that the church plays in this process. It is not hope or medicine, it's hope and medicine. And this isn't just with mental health. You can see this in cancer and other diseases as well. Believing that you're going to get better, whether it's by decreasing inflammation or stress or whatever the process is, the scientific empirical evidence suggests that you get better. Now here's the problem, right? I said that the medicine is important, mental health care is important. The problem is there are just not enough psychiatrists and mental health practitioners. Most of you have probably experienced this. There's just not enough people around to take care of all of the burden of illness. And again, I wanted to encourage you with some scientific data and some results that support the idea that there's something that could be done and the important role that you all will play in helping to stem this tide. This work published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2016, and it was work done in Zimbabwe. And in this setting, there are 10 psychiatrists for about 13 million people, all right? So the disparity between providers and those who need care is much greater, right? In some sense, this is more than Jesus is even trying to feed the 5,000 folks, right? This is 10 to 13 million. And what they did in this setting was they wanted to see if they can deliver culturally appropriate care. And so what they tested in this study was if they could train health practitioners or basically low-cost mental health workers. And the folks that they trained in this community, believe it or not, were grandmothers. Because they said grandmothers deliver the most therapeutic care they have. So they trained them in a form of therapy, right? And then they had these friendship benches where the grandmas talked to the people that had problems. So they had folks who just saw the psychiatrist and folks saw the psychiatrist and got the grandma therapy. And believe it or not, the folks who got the grandma therapy did much better. Again, culturally appropriate care. Because it turns out when you have diseases like depression, which cause the greatest burden of illness of any disease in the world, right? More than diabetes, cancer, heart disease, depression is number one. Therapy is also useful treatment. And it means that in this setting, the culturally appropriate care delivered by the grandma, the big mamas, right, could actually help the community get better. And for me, I imagine a world in which the church could mobilize people and train them to deliver these therapies in this way such that our communities can get healthier. So again, two simple pieces of scientific observations. One, right, we don't have more illness, we just don't get as much care, right? But hope is medicine. And there are things that the church can do to help people get better from the illnesses they're suffering. I'll end on these 2 points because I've got like 2 minutes, right? So what can we do for our own mental health, right? I'll say this again. All of this is, again, framed in the context of this original sermon for Jesus. And I framed it in terms of the idea that your brain and connected to the spirit. And I think it's always important to remember that when you have this organ in your head, it does not exist independently of your body. Right? So the brain doesn't feed itself. You put food in your mouth, it processes in your gut, goes to your brain, right? And your brain, it doesn't deliver oxygen to itself. The lungs do that. The whole body works together to support the brain. And so if you want to think about your own mental health, right? The obvious thing would be to suggest that you talk to a therapist or see a psychiatrist, but it's also really important to take care of your body. The rest of this meeting is increasingly important because it's going to talk about things like diet and exercise and sleeping well, right? We spend half of our time in our lives, half of our time asleep, right? From the time we're born to the time we die, right? And it's not because it's nothing. There are active things happening when you are asleep that help you do better when you are awake. If you take people and they don't sleep for 3 days, their mental health ain't good, right? And so part of taking care of mental health is going to be the importance of diet and exercise and sleep. And finally, I'll end here with the great mental health crisis that Jesus had, right? And so the story, as you know, starts, it's on this mountain. And there's another scene that's a really poignant scene when Jesus has his own mental health crisis. And I think we've stigmatized mental health so much that we forget that God who became man had a mental health crisis, right? And so many times when we think about the role of leaders, we think that leaders are always supposed to have it together. And it is the leading that can many times produce a sense of isolation and its own mental health crisis. Jesus was so bad that he was crying and sweating and blood was coming out. This is a mental health, if we saw that on the street, you would call, Jesus have a 72-hour hold, right? And so I want to normalize the idea of what the impact of leadership, because I know there are leaders in here, and life doesn't go away when you start to lead. So I want to encourage all of you out here who are leaders that there is help available for you. I want to encourage you who are being led to encourage your leaders. Give them a good word. Give them a little bit of hope as well. We make the mistake. Jesus needed to be encouraged too, right? And so I'll leave you with this, right? I came here to talk about the state of Black mental health. I started with this probably strange sermon that Jesus started with. It might have left some of you a little bit confused. But I do think there was something so important to this message that Jesus was giving in terms of mental health. And it is your attitude, where you store your treasure, and your ability to take care of and handle your worries. So thank you all so much for having me here. It's been quite the pleasure and the honor. Thank you.